Hello, everybody. Welcome to the Democratic Dialogic Education podcast. And my name is Eugene Matusov. I'm professor of University of Delaware. And let me introduce, first of all, of our podcast and then today's topic and our guest, Jim Rietmulder. So our podcast existed for already several years, but we are trying now a new format of that, and that format will take at least two types of the formats. One format it will be interviews. This is what we're going to do today. This interview with Jim, and another things will hopefully this. Interview provoked many questions, disagreements, agreements, doubts, associations in new comments. And all of them welcome. Please write them down. We will publish this podcast on at least actually three platforms. Two Facebook groups is Dialogic Pedagogy Journal and University of Students, but it also will be on the YouTube. So in any of the places, wherever you find you, just please make your comments about that. And in a few weeks, we collect these comments, your comments, questions, and again, whatever you want to write. And I will try to address them in a special podcast that will be podcast response. So another announcement about that next, we're planning to do a next podcast interview. The interview will be with me, Eugene Matusov, about a new book that just came out. My book, the book title is Post-Enlightenment Self-Education Toward the Age of Human Dignity. And that interview will be conducted, the host will be Mikhail Gradovsky from Norway. So we will announce about that a little bit later. I think it will be at the end of July, beginning of August. And the podcast response will be probably also at the end of July. We will see how it will take. It depends on how quickly you will write your comments and questions, associations, and so on and so forth. So this is about the format. So now let me introduce, first of all, the topic, and then I will introduce Jim. The topic today, what we want to discuss, this is what I want to interview Jim, is about democratic education and politics. And the reason for that, there are many reasons for that, but one of kind of immediate reason was that at the end of this year, we will have a dialogic pedagogy or dialogic education conference at the end of the year online. It will be international. And this is like a maybe top secret that's coming from organizers of this conference, because the primary topic of this, or they want to focus us on discussing this issue of dialogic education and politics. And this topic promoted by the recent events, political events in United States, in Europe, in Canada, in many other Western countries, with these students' protests against the war in Gaza, primarily, and so it's raising many interesting questions about relationship between dialogic education and politics, and also student movement in Serbia, which is it's another student movement not related to issue of Gaza, but it's internal affairs of Serbia. Hopefully, at some point, Anna Marjanovic Shane might be interested in discussing this topic. Maybe at the conference, maybe before that, we will see that. So. and people might say, why is it now we discussing democratic education and politics? But I don't know, Jim might want to discuss whatever he wants to discuss, so I will ask questions to him. But in my view, the democratic education and dialogic education, there is a strong connection between them, especially for I came to democratic education through dialogic education. So I started realizing that true dialogic education can be only democratic. That's another story, which is interesting. Feel free to ask these questions, or maybe Jim wants to discuss that. It's up to him. So that's why I wanted to introduce Jim right now and explain why I invited Jim and why I think Jim is the best person to talk about democratic education and politics. Jim Rietmulder, co-founder of the Democratic School. It's called the Circle School. The school is located nearby Harrisburg in Pennsylvania in the United States. It was established 41 years ago. That's such a huge period of time and a lot of experiences. And Jim was founder and staff member. And I would want to add that Jim is theoretician, in my view, of democratic education in general. And I would say the Circle School in specifically, and also I would say philosopher of education. That's in my view. And I wouldn't say recently because it's before COVID, just before COVID, Jim published this wonderful book, highly recommend this book. It's maybe we should have a podcast about that book as a separate things. The book title, When Kids Rule the School, The Power and Promise of Democratic Education. He put in the title, Democratic Education. So we can interrogate and ask him, what does it mean, democratic education? Okay, Jim, let me ask you, do you want to add something about yourself? Something that maybe I didn't mention that you want to, I forgot to say something about you, something important?
Thank you, Eugene. I think you've covered it pretty well. That's fascinating to hear your topic. When you said you wanted to talk about politics and democratic education, I really had very little idea of what you meant about either word. What is democratic education and what do you mean by politics? Are you talking about national politics, global politics, or the politics within the community of a democratic school? And of course, all of those apply in democratic education. And then what makes a democratic school is also a wide open topic. What would you like to ask me?
Okay, let me start with these questions are terrific, but let me ask you, what do you mean by the democratic education? Because again, it's in the title of your book. You cannot just get out of this. You said that, not me. And what do you mean by that? In terms of the politics, a good question, and I mean all of above and more than that. And I will ask some other questions, but definitely I mean like global politics about, I created a big list of what can be called politics, like civil rights movements, anti-war movement, feminism, anti-racism, Palestinianism, like Free Palestine, Globalized Intifada, From the River to the Sea, Occupy, anti-globalization movement, ecological movement, global warming threats, anti-capitalism movement, progressivism, also things like eating only vegetarian food or healthy food movement. It's also political movement. Peace movement, pro-choice issue of abortion, animal rights movement, LGBTQ, especially transgender rights movement, communism, social justice. Let's go to the like anti-colonialism, anti-imperialism, anarchism, communism. But let's go to the right, like MAGA movement, Tea Party movement, traditional values, family values movement, agitation for or against political parties, like for or against Republican Party, Democratic Party, Green Party, Socialist Party, and so on, so forth, including, of course, local politics. That will be very interesting. Local at many different levels. Could be local in the state, local in the local communities, local at the school, and so on and so forth. And if you ask me, like how I understand politics, it's politics is a kind of imposition of ideas, action, beliefs, behaviors on people who disagree with them in some legitimate form, and legitimate form for people on whom things are imposed. Politics is, it's not about like what we try to do right now, to figure out some ideas, because that's, we're not imposing on each other in that sense. Even if we're introducing that, we can agree, disagree, and the goal is, at least I don't see the goal that you start thinking like Eugene, or I should think like Jim. It's not the thing. It's trying to figure out something. So in this case, that's what's interesting. The dialogue, it's kind of almost like I feel anti-political in that sense, although they have complex relations with them, which is, I'm not going to talk, it's focus on you. So, okay, so the first question probably, what you think about what democratic education is from your point of view? And what's your philosophy and philosophy of the school about relationship between the school and political agenda? Thank you.
My own thinking about what makes a school democratic is that basically decision-making authority is shared equitably by those who are affected by this decision or likely to be affected, and also that there's due regard given to both individual rights and the common welfare. So it's equitable sharing with due regard for individual rights and also due regard for the common welfare. So that's what I mean by it. But I should say that there's a lot of disparity among my colleagues' schools about what democratic education is. Some see democratic education as a social justice movement, that is youth rights or youth liberation. Some see it as a movement within education, which is more what I see. Some see democratic education, not among my colleagues' schools, but I have seen the term democratic education used to refer to the conventional schools within a democratic nation, where the democracy or democratic principles may not be applied within the schools. The schools may be dominated by a coercive curriculum and an authoritarian regime, but the term is still applied. So there's a lot of variation, and I can speak for myself and for the Circle School, primarily for myself, but also for the Circle School, rather than for all democratic schools together. We, in an exercise over the last 6 months, a group of schools or staff members from schools have worked on arriving at what are the things that we share as a group of schools, that is, it would encompass the broadest range of democratic schools. And I think there's broad agreement on about half a dozen things. And then there are also some, maybe half a dozen or so substantial differences as well.
I just want to add that this is terrific because I was a few years ago, maybe 2 or 3 years ago, I wrote a conclusion of the special issue that published in Dialogic Pedagogy Journal on democratic education. Actually, democratic and dialogic education, it was a special issue on that. And through this, working on this issue, I was not editor of that issue. It was Anna was editor of this issue, one of the editors of the issue, but she started telling me how people differently understand the term. And this is including what you mentioned, like civic education, for example, that is considered that will be considered, or just learning about democracy. It could be even done. I remember in Soviet Union, we studied that and would be considered to be part of the, some people would consider that part of democratic education. Not, by the way, we in Soviet Union there was a huge criticism of democracy, bourgeois democracies, of course. And another interesting understanding of that I came across, which is interesting because, like, why is it even called democratic education? But it's still interesting. It's the idea that who making decision about their own education and life. And whether or not it's educators who know better or society, or is it the students themselves making the decision. And the decision, of course, about like whether to study, what to study, how to study, why to study, all of these questions, they can do it themselves or with the help of other people if they find it's useful for them. It could be peers, or it could be professional like staff or professional educators and so forth. So it's very interesting notion of democratic education. It can be so broad, and people might think they're talking about the same thing, and it's maybe not exactly the same, and maybe even more that we were talking about that some other people. Feel free. This is I'm addressing to our audience. Feel free to bring some other definition of democratic education that you come across or even invented yourself. That will be very interesting. Thank you.
There is another distinction that might be helpful to call attention to, and that is the way the school itself is sort of conceived. And I guess a way of focusing on it would be to think about the concept of institutional voice. In some schools, there is essentially no such thing as an institutional voice. The school is conceived of as maybe a collection of individuals who can vote by majority vote to express on behalf of the school whatever they choose. And on the other hand, the institutional voice can be regarded as something that's distinct from the collective, from the majority viewpoints and majority votes. It's highlighted by recent events with universities and the allegations about application or non-application of reasonable standards for free expression on campus. So a question is, does the school have a voice that is separate from the voice expressed in majority votes of its members? And I think that's something that is not, it's not uniform among the schools that are colleagues of the Circle School. That is, some viewing it one way and some another. The Circle School did recently adopt an institutional voice policy, and basically it says that the school as an institution won't take a position on matters of, say, national political concern, and that instead the institutional voice is reserved for things that are central to the school's mission. And part of the purpose of the institutional voice policy is to sort of protect the interests of the school, and yet to still allow great diversity of viewpoint within the school, and to allow free expression of personal viewpoints. So that's a difference in the way one might view a democratic school as well.
Is it true? Okay, I'm listening to you. I'm trying to translate to our topic, and I'm thinking about: is it true that school, the Circle School, does not have political agenda? Or, listening to you, I'm thinking maybe it has, but it's limited to educational issues.
Yeah, I think that's a fair way of saying it. That yes, to the degree that how we structure our schools and what's the best way to educate children, to the degree that you consider that a political question, then yes, the Circle School has that political agenda. And so the idea is that, in my view, the Circle School should feel free to assert its views about education and democratic education. And in fact, unlike most of our colleague schools, the Circle School has two founding purposes. That is, back in 1984, and continuing to this day in our bylaws and articles of incorporation, we cite two purposes. One is to run a school according to certain principles, and the other is to do so in a way that can be replicated and adapted by others, and to be an advocate for this kind of education. So if you regard that as a political issue, and sometimes it is and sometimes it isn't, then yes, the school has a political agenda. And in order to maximize the school's effectiveness in pursuing that purpose, that agenda, the institutional voice policy limits the school's voice to those matters that are essential to its purposes. So the school won't willy-nilly take a position on either political candidates or proposals for public policy, except to the extent on policy, except to the extent that a policy would relate directly to how we educate children.
Mhm, mhm. Okay, and why is that? Like, I'm interested now to hear your kind of philosophical views. Like, I know that many democratic schools, and we will discuss that maybe at some point in our interview, have a very strong political views, and political means partisan view, like a political partisan view, or particular views on the global issues about like social justice and many other things. But if correct me if I'm wrong, but the circle school trying to avoid that. Why? And what's the philosophy behind that?
Yeah, okay. Well, why do we have an institutional voice policy and why are we limiting that institutional voice? And I guess I can think of two reasons offhand, Eugene. One is that I think that part of being a democratic school, and I didn't mention this before, but the way it overlaps with that second purpose of the circle school, to be something that can be replicated and widely adopted. In order to be widely adopted, as in maybe, if I could wave my magic wand and replace our public school system with democratic schools, I would. But in order to be that widely applied, the school must be able to accommodate and welcome and educate families and children with a wide variety of views. And so if the school allowed itself to be associated with a particular constellation of political views, it wouldn't be applicable on a wide scale. So one reason we have that policy is to protect that founding purpose of the school, the purpose being to model a form of education that could be applied across the board. Second reason is much more practical and based on what we've observed in some of our colleagues' schools, and that is that some schools do express views that tend towards one political perspective. And once that happens, then the school is less likely to attract a political diversity of viewpoints and more likely to attract more of the same kind. So if we want a diversity of viewpoints, which in my view also makes for the best kind of education, that is, if we want a population of families and students and staff who don't all think alike and see political issues alike, then we need to remain open to a variety of perspectives. So there's two reasons for that institutional voice policy.
Mhm. Okay, let me ask you kind of how to say that evil question. The evil question coming. What about the third reason, financial? The financial reason, like having a broader political spectrum, will allow school to have more, not only diverse students, just more students, just because it's since they will be attracted to the school and they feel their view are not discriminated, so they have much more probability that they will join the school, and you will have more students, more parents, more tuitions, more money, and the school can be financially sustainable.
I think the opposite is true,
Ah,
actually. I think that that a school that's associated with a particular end of the political spectrum in some markets is likely to thrive better than a school that welcomes all perspectives. It's the echo chamber thing that we see in social media, that people are uncomfortable when exposed to views that are in disagreement with their own, and more comfortable having their own views reinforced. And so in some markets, I think having a school sort of spiral into a niche, a political niche, may help them thrive. If they're living in a community and drawing from a community for their students that tends to be more homogenous in its political outlook, then they're going to thrive financially as well. On the other hand, in our market and in most of the schools' markets, it's not popular to say we welcome MAGA viewpoints as much as we welcome woke viewpoints, as much as we welcome centrist and moderate viewpoints. We welcome conservatives, we welcome liberals, and we welcome illiberals at both ends of the spectrum. And we even welcome some political nut jobs. We want a variety, and that's a hard sell, frankly. That's a harder sell than, come here if you support this kind of policy and this kind of policy.
Mhm.
Does that make sense?
Well, for me, it makes sense. It's actually, let me bring even bigger philosophical issue, which is actually, I should admit, you, even before this last book that you wrote, because it's a theme that I first, I don't even remember when I learned it from you. I think actually I just realized that we know each other. This is probably our anniversary, because 15th anniversary that we know each other, because I think we met in summer 2010. But anyway,
Wow.
that's how how much we know each other and benefit from each other. But one thing that I benefit from you, you talked about school as scaled down society. And back then, I was always that notion of society always kind of, I wouldn't say bother me, but it's how to say that it penetrated me. Like, why society? At that time, I would be much more comfortable if you say community. Not even scale down. Scale down, that's another story. But I'm just thinking, like, why you call society and not community? And the more time passed, the more I was thinking about that, thanks to you. And the more I realized that this idea of the community, which might consist of many notion of society, school as society, that may consist of many communities, and even people who can be considered foreigners, legitimate foreigners, people who don't belong any community and just there by themselves. And it's legit in the society, but might not be that legit in the community or the tribe when, especially ideology, very strong, you need to be us, and usually it's us against them who outside somewhere outside of our community. And society doesn't not necessarily need that. It has tensions as any society, and that's why it needs democracy, because it has to deal with the many communities with diverse values. So I was actually again very much appreciated that you introduced this notion of scaled down society and you start talking about society. I think, again, I don't know anyone, maybe I didn't read something, that who is talking about in education, talk about a school as society, not as a community, but exactly society, and interesting is scaled down society. So I wonder, like, if you want to comment on that.
Sure, sure. As background, I should comment that the Circle School's sort of tagline slogan is practicing life, kids practicing life. And I summarize our theory of education as agency in community, the individual in a group, in a collective. I think that the word society, yeah, let me do a little defining here. I think of society as mm, the structures, the sort of outwardly visible elements of the world. And I think more of community as more the inside. That is, you can give a pretty objective description of society. You walk down Main Street and you describe what you see, well, the institutions and so on. And I think of community as something that is less visible. It's more like a culture. The culture is hard. It's harder to characterize culture than it is to characterize the institutions that make up the world. So I think of society as being more that outward face and community more the inward. But I think of the Circle School and other schools like us as being scaled down society because we do have those structures that would characterize a society where other kinds of schools don't. So we have our own executive, legislative, and judicial branches of school government. We have a judicial system that in some ways resembles the American judicial system and in some ways does not. We have formal meetings. We operate our school meeting by Robert's Rules of Order. We have a law book with a couple of hundred laws in it. It now takes 330 some pages to print it out. So these are tangible, visible structures that I would say make up parts of society. And then on the other hand, the school is the people who are part of the school. Let's start with a smaller circle. Students and staff make up a community defined by our membership in the daily program of the school. The school has a broader community when it expands to include the parents of those students, and still a broader community when it includes alumni and alumni families. So all of those are communities at various scales. But then even within the daily community of the school, the people who gather each day, there are communities within that. So there's the kids who gather in the computer room. There's the what we call the NRG, a group that loves to do outdoor adventures. Each of those form their own sort of sub-communities with lots of overlap, which is a key piece of it. So that would be my take on society and community, both being important elements at the Circle School, but to me having a slightly different feel. And then sometimes, I mean, those are terms that slip and slide, both of those. So sometimes community and society would refer to the same loose concept.
Mm-hmm. No, thank you. That's helpful. Thank you. Well, let me move to the another kind of area of the questions, which is we're moving from philosophy to the practice. And the practice with relationship between democratic education and politics. And again, the school has now long traditions, long experiences, the diversity of them, interesting tensions. So if you look like for 41 years, all of these experiences, have you ever experienced when participants of the school, and by participants of the school, this is very timely what you were talking about. I mean, everyone, it's not only students, it's not, let's include staff, parents, alumnus, friends of the school, I don't know, like a very big kind of an amorphous kind of what you can call school community or school society in the very broad sense of that. Whether or not the people try to push some political agenda outside of education, it's not about promoting democratic education, but taking particular stances about partisan politics or some particular agenda, like can be food, eating healthy food or something like that, and trying to impose that on the entire school. Say this is our school is staying for that, and everyone has to be there. or either tolerate that or leave the school, because this is what our school is about. Have you had these attempts of that, what they were about, and how sounds like the school successfully deal with that issue? So how the school was dealing with that, and did it lead to splits? Some people left just because they couldn't stand how the school stand, either because of the agenda or because reverse thing, because they were not allowed to monopolize the school political voice, and so on and so forth. So whatever, and maybe I'm not even asking about something because I cannot even imagine about that, and you maybe something will come to your mind thinking about these experiences that you had for 41 years. Okay, please.
Sure, there are probably numerous examples of it, most of them on a very small scale, and most of them sort of very local politics. The school meeting votes on legislation commonly, that law book that I mentioned with 200 laws in it. Every one of those laws has been subject to debate and vote at school meeting, and amendments and repeals are all subject to that. So there's lots and lots of local politics about many things, and some generate a lot of controversy, and some seem surprising to some of us when there's very little controversy. But I can feel myself being reluctant to to describe some of them. So let me go far back in history, at least to
Yeah.
begin, and that is we have groups called corporations. They're sort of like clubs or private interest groups, and those groups can raise money to do their favorite activities. So many years ago, this would have been back in the 90s, I think, we had a group that um, had the Coca-Cola company put a vending machine on the premises to with the proceeds to go to this group fundraising, and so it made fizzy drinks, sodas, available, very easily available to students, and that, of course, annoyed some of the nutrition aware people in the community who thought that we shouldn't make sugary drinks available to children. This was back in the 90s. I mean, it comes and goes as a sort of a hot button political issue, but with childhood obesity becoming a prominent issue, maybe it's more of an issue now than then, but it was a significant issue then. And so when it seemed to be rampant, somebody proposed that to school meeting that we ban the vending machine from the school's premises, that it was not a good use of space, and on top of that, there were these the health issues. Uh, so there's a lot of controversy about that, and school meeting did eventually vote to have the machine removed. Um, School meeting stopped short, and in fact, maybe nobody proposed to ban sales of sweets. And in fact, that's always been present at school, to the great annoyance of some. We have a sales table at school where anybody who wants to sell something can put things on the sales table. And the bulk of what's on the sales table is garbage food. I mean, it's sugars, it's processed stuff. Maybe you can tell how I feel about it. Um, but I don't know that anybody has proposed banning that those foods in recent times. But it's been a political issue that comes and
Mhm.
goes a bit. And then sometimes it has come up. I'm not sure whether you'd count this as politics, but energy drinks. When energy drinks came along and someone started selling energy drinks, that too became an issue. Um, I think the tipping point on that particular issue was when a teenager didn't hesitate to sell an energy drink to a young child. It was an energy drink that had all kinds of warnings on the label, including the word death, uh, and that was too much. And so after I'm not remembering specifically, but I'm imagining it was many weeks of debate on the floor of school meeting. An energy drink rule was adopted that said basically you can have an energy drink at school and consume it, but only if you have brought it from your home. So essentially, we were saying we're going to put this choice, which is not really political. The political choice is whether the school should allow it or not. But we're going to put the choice back in the realm of family. So no, you can't sell an energy drink at school. You can't give it away to somebody else. You can only possess or drink it if you've brought it from home. Incidentally, the young child who bought the energy drink took one sip of it, said, "Yuck," and didn't want any more of it. But so that was a political issue. And then let's see, more recently, just this year, there were two very political issues that came up. One was a teen proposed a rule to make it illegal to misgender somebody, to call them by pronouns other than the pronouns that they preferred, which of course is a very politically sensitive topic. But this was going to require people to speak the pronouns of others only as each person preferred. There was a lot of heated discussion over that. And although I think it only took, we usually do 2 readings of a rule. So a proposal is made, it gets a first reading, but we don't vote on it until our session the following week. This one may have happened in, maybe it was 2 or 3 weeks, that maybe it went through two rounds of debate. But what we wound up doing instead of adopting that rule was to amend our existing harassment rule and make intentional misgendering one example of what could constitute harassment. And so that was a satisfying enough solution to enough people to get that one passed by. Let's see. I'm trying to think, have we had situations where expressions of political views by the school or school members outside of school has been an issue? We, as a nonprofit, we are forbidden by law as a school to endorse candidates for public office or to lobby public legislators. And that's always been clear, for example, in our field trip policy about what you can and can't do. I'm not offhand thinking of an example of some outbound off-campus expression of the school that would fall into that category. And then there was a case that involves a situation that involves some nuance. One of our internal rules is that when we adopt legislation or take an executive action by vote, the motion that is adopted includes a statement of rationale. Why are we doing this? So an example might be for safety and security, or to make a technical correction to a rule, or to make something, to clarify something. So there's a rationale that's adopted along with it. And the interesting case I'm thinking of now, the situation was where the rationale was very political, but the substance of the proposed amendment was not. So the proposal was to amend every place in our 330-page management manual that used gendered language and convert it to non-gender specific language. And that was, I think ultimately we identified about 36 places where that language occurred. Now, most of the laws in our law book, most of the management manual is decades old. And so, the use of pronouns and gendered language wasn't even on the radar back when most of these were adopted. But there isn't much controversy about the use of non-gender specific language. It's been used, well, literally for hundreds of years, but at least for decades in legislation and public documents and in the world in legal language. I think it's always been true to avoid, um, to be clear and to avoid having to specify a gender. But the rationale that was proposed had to do with wanting to change the world, wanting to support the LGBTQ plus community everywhere, and to push society in that direction. And so in that case, and that one also was very heated. You know, people who feel passionately about an issue are not generally receptive to nuanced interpretations and so on. But that one was adopted eventually, I think without any nay votes. I think what was adopted was with a rationale that said something that was not politically charged. It was not suggesting that we're doing this in order to change the world. Does that make sense? So there
Yes.
are two examples.
Yeah. Let me ask you about two cases that I know that happened in the school, and one I don't know whether or not it's happened. It's just happened in another schools, like when the parents and especially parents discuss that. Let me start with that case, and then two cases that I know some kind of relevant to the school. The first one is about using gadgets at the school, like computers, phones, tablets, and so on. You understand what it's about. And there is a claim in some schools, and you probably some even know what the schools I'm talking even about. They ban use of or severely limit that, and their justification is that it affects social life of the students. They think that it's very separates people, and this gadget separate people, especially younger children and teenagers. Actually, adults probably as well. And so, for the sake of that, some schools adopted rules either not having at all these gadgets or severely limiting them. I don't know if any attempts were done at the school or not, and can you comment on that? And then there are two other cases, which I know that were relevant to the school, much more
Sure,
than that.
sure.
Okay.
I think the general issue that you're getting at is, I'm going to call it libertarian, communitarian polarity. So you could
Okay.
call it a spectrum on that dimension. Some of our colleague schools tend to be libertarian, some of them tend to be communitarian. And what I mean by libertarian is, with respect to this particular issue, is that the school, which is government, the school has no authority to impose on anybody's freedom to the degree of banning electronics devices. And then at the communitarian end, the decisions would more often, or the thinking about an issue would more often take into account what's best for the health of the community. I mean, this is certainly not specific to democratic schools. This is just a general thing about human beings and groups. What's the proper role of our collective opinions or our collective policies? Is it, to what degree can our collective health dictate constraints on individual freedom? And so, yes, I know that at least one of our colleague schools, well-respected, highly esteemed colleague school, has, as you said that, well, for the health of the community, we are going to ban the use by individuals of devices, or not ban them, but, and that, I think that in most cases, it's not an outright ban, it's constraints on the use of devices. And sometimes deciding what the constraints should be is where the devil lies in the details. That the constraints might be, well, you can use electronics for school business or for academic studies, but not for entertainment.
Yeah.
And that's a really hot one. Well, okay, so now we're going to privilege certain kinds of activities, and I think in one case, and I'm guessing it's probably the same one you're referring to, there is a provision for exceptions. So some person or small group can make exceptions. Anybody can appeal to that group to say, well, I want to do so and so, and I need my iPad for that, or I need to do so and so for that, or I'm studying violence in video games, and so I want permission to use my device, and also I need an exception to the rule that bans certain kinds of content. So, then the question is, well, wait, so who gets to decide what's worthy of an exception? And on what basis do we decide that? So, yeah, that can be a really hot button issue. We had it come up, let's see, it was last year, I think, 2023 or 2024, when Roblox became a point of some debate and discussion. Roblox is a platform rather than a particular video game. It's a platform on which there are, I believe at this point, it's probably more than 100,000 different games. And the Roblox platform allows the game publishers, the game makers, whoever posts it, to rate the game. Well, we've had a long-standing rule, dates back to our earliest internet rules. Oh, actually, even before that, when there were video games, a rule that bans certain kinds of content. And although the issue has come up, and this is a political hot potato every time it comes up, who should decide what is appropriate content? And so the route that we took was actually in some ways similar to what I described earlier about the energy drinks. We said we as a school meeting don't want to be in the business of placing ratings on video productions. We're not, it's just too narrow a field for us to be good at, and we don't want to take that on. So we said, okay, in the early days, this was back in the 90s or early 2000s, we said, we're going to allow games that are rated for young kids and for young teens, but we're not going to allow games that are rated for mature content or X-rated. And our law even went into detail about, well, if it's in this middle category, there are certain descriptors of content that would make a production allowed and certain that wouldn't. So with Roblox eventually, and this is recent, for years Roblox went unregulated at our school. So the rule eventually said, well, okay, Roblox isn't banned, but when you use Roblox, you have to, first of all, you have to use your own account. Roblox, unlike some others, each person using it must have their own account, and the account, according to the Roblox rules, the account must be either created by or authorized by a minor's parent. So in theory, if you are using Roblox with your own account, then it is in some ways, to some degree, under your parents' control. So we said, okay, in our Roblox rule, you can use Roblox, but you can only use your own account. And that was an attempt to throw that decision back into the hands of families again. And furthermore, and I don't remember the details, but basically we said you have to abide by the ratings that are given by the Roblox publisher. And so that was, again, it was avoiding the need for school meeting, for staff and students to view productions and decide whether they were appropriate for kids of various ages. So devices, the current status at the Circle School is that there is no, the law book does not ban devices based on the principle that device usage is harmful or beneficial. Instead, the law doesn't really take a position on that. But there are things that we have found that differentiate the Circle School's approach to devices from some of our colleague schools. What we have observed in the last 10 years is that most visitors, when we debrief them at the end of a visit and ask them, what are your impressions? a majority of visitors have said, well, there's less device usage here. And so we've wondered why and studied that. And I think it's a combination of things, but one of them is that we have a beautiful campus with lots of resources. And so there's a lot to do in addition to device usage. And so part of it is the attraction of other things to do, of other activities. Part of it is that our computer room is, it's relatively small. It has only a handful of computer workstations available, and that limits it. And to be blunt about it too, that room is filled by. You walk into the room and the stench is sometimes overpowering. That is the odors given off by the kids who are in there. And that's partly a function of the age and their physical developmental status. So that turns some users off and some not. So there's some self-limiting factors. And then the law book does say that if you are on one of the school's computers or tablets and somebody else wants to use it, if you've been on for more than 30 minutes, you must yield to that other person. And so the computer corporation has a sign-in system for enforcing that. And I think mostly it's enforced informally, but that's a limiting factor as well. So there are a number of limiting factors to device usage, but at least at the Circle School, school meeting has opted out of making laws that require school meeting to judge the value or disvalue of device usage.
You actually bringing a very interesting points, and I just want to bring a little bit conceptualization of that, and I don't know whether or not you agree with that or not. Talking about like management and governance, like for example, 30 minutes use of that. That kind of remind me writings by libertarian economists and philosophers, and I'm thinking about Hayek, first of all, but Berlin. And they talk about like negative and positive freedom. And looks like the school mostly focusing on kind of negative freedom, negative in not necessarily that it's bad, but negative in the sense that there is limits, they set a limit on something, like, for example, use of 30 minutes. But nevertheless, within that limits, it could be limits by time, it could be limits by well, I don't know, you said this about games can be only for younger children or middle childhood, something like that, but not for the adults. That's another limit. But within that limit, there is freedom of the students to use the freedom within that limits in the way how they want to do that. Where the positive freedom, which is what can be called communal thing, when the freedom is defined, the goal is defined, the values is defined. How you going to that goal, you can have freedom to come to that goal, but goal or endpoints established, like for example, social justice. We should work for social justice. So the whole thing should be about social justice. If it's not about social justice, that's not good, or is it work even against a little bit social justice? How we understand that can be good, and it's usually fuzzy defined. Nobody trying to set what exactly social justice is, or even if it's decided that it's how to say there can be interpretation there, but nevertheless the authority will interpret that. So in a way, you never know fully whether or not you violate it or not, because that authority will judge that. And it sounds like the school more on, if we use, again, remember you introduced this libertarian versus communal, more on kind of libertarian principles of negative freedom, rather than positive freedom, which is communal idea that we work for, like in betterment of society, for example, and so on and so forth. So it should be about making society better. So, for example, collection of the post stamps, not very clear how it will improve the society. So it's kind of under suspicion, activity under suspicion. It sounds almost like frivolous. Like we have so many problems in society. What the hell are you doing with that? But school is not. No, we're not working for betterment of society, but we're setting limits. How? Can you comment on that,
Yeah,
please?
and there's a lot of variety among the democratic schools, some being more libertarian, some being more communitarian. It's currently an issue that's under discussion at the Circle School, um, and it's directly related to freedom. If there's an absence of sufficient structure, does that limit the freedom of a child to do or discover certain things? Does it put too much emphasis on self-direction and initiative and motivation? So we have a structure we call connectors, which are staff members. Each student is or each staff member has a collection of students, and the connectors. One of the connectors' jobs is to, in a very informal, low-key way, to to observe the quality of that student's experience. And prior to our having the connector structure, there was sort of an unspoken expectation that every staff member is responsible for the quality of every student's experience. And that's impossible to do. And so the idea was, well, we want to make sure that every student has is getting what they want to get out of the school. And so we have the connector structure. We also more recently have put in place a conflict responders structure. And in both cases, neither the connector nor conflict responders, who will be mostly students, there's no authority really to impose something, but they're there to facilitate. And so there's a libertarian flavor to that, and also a communitarian flavor to that. That is, the school community wants to enhance the experience of its members, but without imposing unduly on freedom. Eugene, in the conceptual framework of the Circle School, we would be more likely to talk about two kinds of coercion: curricular coercion and civil or civic conversion. Let's call it civil coercion. Um, Curricular coercion being something that we demand, that the school or the community demand that you do for your own good. And civic or civil coercion being something that is imposed on you because it's necessary for the operation of the community, or that school meeting has determined is necessary for that. And so we have an example of the civic coercion would be, we have always had a chore system. Everyone is required to do a daily housekeeping chore. We've done it under different systems, and there are a variety of rules to it, but it's a pretty elaborate system that involves absolutely everybody. Curricular coercion, on the other hand, would be if school meeting voted to require every 12-year-old to take a civics class or a math class. Of course, a civics class would be absurd. Some people think the entire school is a civics class. And then there are more subtle ways of framing it too. Some of the schools, as we did 30 years ago, tend to view participation in school governance as something that's necessary to get the value of an education in this school. We've left that behind, but that's an important one that has to do with the question of the two kinds of freedom, or curricular coercion and civil coercion. The idea being that, well, now my view, and increasingly the consensus view within the Circle School community, is to state it one way, that a student could spend their entire primary, secondary school careers at the Circle School and never participate in school governance, and still get the full value and benefit of a circle school education. I believe that wholeheartedly. And yet the smaller, newer schools who are very focused on the governance, which is the most visible aspect of some democratic schools, tend to view that as, it's important for you to do this. It can be couched as a civic duty. In fact, at least one of our colleague schools requires a group of people, it's a rotating group, but requires them to attend sessions of school meeting to do that collective business. And so in that sense, it could be couched as a civic duty. But it also satisfies the view that that's what this kind of education is about. Now, even someone who has no participation, nominally has no participation in school governance, is obviously living within that matrix of laws and civic duties. And so they are involved in governance in that sense, but more at the receiving end than the administrative end. Interesting balance, and there's obviously no single answer. Each community and each society decide that for themselves.
Just probably, I don't know, one comment or two, and then we move to another example. It's interesting. I really like your these two way of thinking of the coercion, two coercions. One, like for your own good, which is I conceptualize usually as educational paternalism. It's like I know better what's good for you, and this is why it should be done. Another kind of it's necessity that coming from necessities and living together. That's also involved necessities, but could be even more than that. And this coercions based on the kind of necessities of the life and necessities of living together. Also that coming from that and kind of compromises that again it's a society consisting of many communities and foreigners or individuals there as well. You need to compromise between different values because you cannot do sometimes all of them at once. It will be nice sometimes, but they often contradict each other. So you have to do that. So one interesting things about that in some societies, actually, and I'm thinking first of all about Soviet Union, from which I came from, they will even not talk about it's good for we curse you for your own good. We curse you in the name of our wonderful society and the communist future. That's why. That's why you have to do that, or even study that. We force you not because we think it's good, because your good should be subordinated to the societal good, and if it's good for the society, it's good for you. That's kind of idea was there. I just like want to bring that sometimes could be abuse on the other side as well, in the sense of that it's not even educational paternalism can be a problem, but that idea that you should subordinate constantly for your society, for the society's sake, it could be a problem as well. And of course, in circle school, there is a lot of at least I see them a lot of countermeasures against that. Involved in that because the rights of the individuals or persons, their human rights are respected as well. So even when necessities are involved, so it's not just okay necessity. Let's do this just because of necessities. There are some kind of measures. Can you talk a little bit about that, and then we shift to another topic?
Yeah, before that, I'd like to introduce another dimension that kind of crosses the libertarian communitarian divide, and that is the developmental stages, developmental capacities, the rules that apply to adults, that is mature individuals, in my view, cannot and do not apply the same way to young children. And yet, sometimes a libertarian philosophy would have us doing exactly that. I think to some degree, we want the circle school to be transparent to the larger world. That is, we don't want to unnecessarily filter stuff out. And yet, on the other hand, it's not responsible to put, say, 4, 5, 6-year-olds in the position of bearing the responsibility and judgment and duties of an adult. And so I have heard from some alumni that they felt it unfair, an undue burden, for example, to be voting on whether or not to suspend or expel a student, which has happened rarely, but has happened in the school's history. And then there are other questions about what is it appropriate for, say, a 4, 5, 6-year-old to have authority over. So in recent years, the Circle School has the democratic processes have delegated more and more away from school meeting, and our Board of Trustees has also imposed requirements on us that in the form of policies, boundaries that we cannot cross or that we must stay within. And that's also a live issue in some democratic schools, and also one way that both libertarian and communitarian principles don't apply quite as straightforwardly as they might to a group of adults. Now, even among adults, not all are mature, and one can argue that there are measures that need to be taken, but we don't go there. But we do go to the place of saying that no, we have there's some areas in which mature responsibility is necessary. Also, a key factor that's related to this is whether the school is a loose association of individuals or whether it's an institution that has its own needs for survival. And the institutional voice policy, for example, would not need to exist if the school were simply an association of individuals who could do whatever they wanted by majority vote. So the presence of an institutional voice policy correctly implies that, at least at the Circle School, we think that the needs of the institution have to be taken into account, and the best way to do that is with people who have a fiduciary responsibility, a legal responsibility to look after those interests. Students have no fiduciary responsibility to the school. They have a moral and maybe ethical responsibility, but not a legal responsibility. And so students in their calculations don't need to make, and in some cases are likely don't have the developmental capacity to make decisions on behalf of the school. They can speak their own mind. So that's a factor that comes into play as well, where sometimes the liberties or the liberty or freedom that school meeting can pass on to students is actually limited by the policies of the Board of Trustees, because they've said, regardless of where we stand, libertarian, communitarian, or anything else, we need to do these things in order to keep the school going and to protect the school's assets. Smaller and younger schools that have less in financial assets and less in history and reputation to protect, the interests of those schools may be less than the interests of a school that is over 40 years old, has a $3 million campus, and intends to be around for a long time, much longer than the average tenure of a student, for example. So there's two more factors to enter into play. Now, would you remind me of the question you want to move on to?
It's another, okay. I'm just thinking about when school participated in state politics and local politics, and I know two examples. Actually, you will be surprised, but I've started thinking in preparation to this podcast, to that interview. I was thinking that I realized that I know you from your school in part, through your school political action on the state level. You will be surprised about that, maybe. I came to the school I become interested in the school, in part because I become interested in democratic education. I told you that when I realized that dialogic education cannot live in full scale without democratic education. And there are two people who actually brought me to the school, to your school. One was Scott Richardson, and I don't know any, actually, or maybe I forgot how he learned about the school.
I'm sorry, who?
Scott Richardson.
Oh, Millersville.
Scott. And another person is Anna Marjanovic Shane, and about her, I know how she learned about the school. She know you through engaging in political action because it was. And you, of course, not correct me, actually, tell me when it exactly happened. I forgot a little bit about that. But when a school in which Anna Marjanovic Shane participated actively, which was Project Learn, progressive school, not democratic progressive school, and your school and some other schools were trying to sue the state of Pennsylvania on the issue of the state required, correct me if I'm wrong, all schools, including private schools, to have Pledge of Allegiance required from the students to start the day with American flags, things like that, and pledge allegiance to the United States. And so it was a kind of alliance of some, I think, private schools to try to change that law, and I think it was successfully changed. Correct me if I'm wrong, but it was one of the big political action that I know that the Circle School involved. Another one, more recent, on which it was on my time, so-called my time, within 15 years of me knowing the school. It's about when you moved to the new building, and there was a toilet court because you decided to make like all gender toilets, which is separate toilet. It's individual separate toilets. And surprisingly, you found, or actually the company, the contractor found there is ordinance, local ordinance, prohibiting something like that, or there should be a very particular way, which is not like that. It should be not all genders, but it should be the males or females. Correct me, can you talk about that?
Sure.
And do you have any more than these two examples when school participated, and how it was done, and whether or not it was only staff involved, or sometimes students involved, or they knew about that? Or can you talk a little bit about that?
Sure. You're talking about two different situations. Let's take that older one first. In the early 2000s, in the wake of the 9/11 attacks, Pennsylvania legislators, in a shockingly by unanimous vote of the two legislative bodies, actually there was one dissenting vote out of hundreds, but adopted a law requiring every student in every school in Pennsylvania, public and private, to recite the Pledge of Allegiance every day. And the Circle School had both principled and practical objections to it. One was that because the practical side of it was that there was never a time in the school day when students and staff were gathered together. That is, we don't have classrooms, we don't have students assigned to classroom teachers, and so just practically it was hard. Now we did come up with a way that we could do it, and we did set it up until we prevailed in our lawsuit. But then the principled objections to it have to do with just fundamental democratic principles, whether libertarian, communitarian, left-wing, right-wing. The idea of government requiring individuals to swear an oath is repugnant. It was then, and it still is now. And so school meeting voted to sue Pennsylvania and claim that the law is unconstitutional. And then our larger governing body also assembled and voted. Actually, what the larger body voted was to leave it up to school meeting. So we filed a lawsuit against Pennsylvania, saying that law was unconstitutional. And later, a few other schools joined the lawsuit, but we were hanging out there alone at first. And the federal district court ruled in our favor, basically said, well, yeah, obviously this is unconstitutional. You can't make people swear an oath of allegiance. Now, this was in a passionate moment after actually it was about a year after the 9/11 attacks. And so there was considerable emotion around it. And yet it was obviously a contradiction to democratic principles. The Commonwealth of Pennsylvania appealed it to a federal appeals court, and we took a field trip me and a few students went to Philadelphia, where it was being heard in the appeals court, a panel of 3 judges, actually, and the appeals court unanimously upheld the lower court's decision that this was plainly unconstitutional. It was almost comical when the Commonwealth had to try to defend that rule. The rule also didn't only say that everybody must swear an oath of allegiance every day. It also said that the school was required to punish or report to parents any student who declined to recite the Pledge of Allegiance. And the Commonwealth had an especially difficult time trying to explain to the appeals court why that provision was necessary and why that wasn't simply punishment for taking a particular viewpoint. So anyway, we prevailed on that one. Students were very much involved in initiating and sustaining that. The second one you're talking about was when the Circle School relocated to its current campus in 2017. The local building code, the state building code, the national building code, and the international building code, and each one is derived partly from the one above it in that hierarchy, with usually some tweaks at each level. But at all four levels, we were informed that the building codes required that each restroom be identified with a sign indicating the gender for which that restroom was dedicated. So our easy way to finesse it was, well, we'll just put up a sign on all the restrooms that say all gender restroom. Well, no, that doesn't meet the building code. You got to name a gender, boys or girls, men or women, male or female. And the contractor's solution to us was to say, well, the contractor who was building the campus actually had 2 sets of signs prepared. One that said all gender restrooms, and the other was half boys and half girls. And their solution was that we would put up the compliant signs, half saying boys and half saying girls. And then as soon as the building inspection was done, then we would take those signs down and put up the all gender signs. Well, for a school that is based on rule of law and a school that expects students and staff to comply with all of its laws, it was just the height of hypocrisy to suggest that we're going to deceive the building inspector and put up the compliance signs and then take them down. So we said, no, we're gonna have to challenge this. And so we submitted an application for a variance, I think. Yeah, that was it. And that variance ultimately, it cost us some money to do that, but that variance ultimately went before a panel of, was it six building inspectors from municipalities in our region. Our region participated in a coalition of 40-some municipalities in this part of Pennsylvania, extending almost all the way between Pittsburgh and Philadelphia. 40-some municipalities that all cooperated in an appeals process. So when there was an appeal such as ours, building code officers from 6 municipalities, not the one under question, would form a panel, and they would hear requests for variances. Well, they heard the request, and we didn't have any legal representation. We just went in and said, here's our issue. Now, the strength of our case was that at that moment, as we pointed out to the panel, at that moment, There was a school district in Pennsylvania being sued because they allowed transgender students to use the restroom of their choice. Another school district was being sued because they would not allow that exact same thing. So there were two lawsuits, and the two lawsuits were in direct contradiction, and neither one, at the moment that we were going before the hearing, neither one of those lawsuits had been resolved. So our case was strong in the sense that we're saying, hey, you know, we're darned if we do and darned if we don't. So we need this variance. And besides, in principle, why shouldn't we be allowed to do this? We have 8 single-use restrooms. We just want to make them all available to everybody. And so the panel voted unanimously to allow that variance. And that variance, we're proud that by our challenging that same variance now applies generally throughout the 40-some municipalities that are covered by that appeals process. And that one too was supported by students. There was less student involvement because it unfolded during the summer months, not during the school year. But it was certainly with the support of most of our community.
This is what I want to ask you, just clarify about the last case about the toilets. Did you do also through the school assembly of this to decide, first of all, there sounds like many decisions there. One decision not to reject the contractor's proposal to kind of smuggle your practice, which considered to be at that time illegal practice, of to not follow that path. And another big decision is about to sue and to try to or overrule this the ordinance of this municipality's ordinance. Did it come through the assembly, or was it decided on some other levels? And the biggest question for me, whether or not the students participate in any ways, because on the first day about the Pledge of Allegiance, you said that students actively participate in that. Was participation of the students there as well? The ones who want to do that, of course. Nobody forced them.
There wasn't much student participation because it happened during summer break.
During summer.
That is, the issue emerged and then went to a hearing between spring recess and when we opened up in the fall. You're asking about the governing body. At that point, we had replaced the assembly with a board of trustees. And we use what's called the formal theory called policy governance that was developed by John Carver. It's associated with John Carver. And under policy governance, the Board of Trustees mostly avoids telling school meeting what it has to do, but rather says, here are the limits. It draws a great big circle and says, you can achieve our ends by any methods other than these, basically. So one of those policies says, well, we can't buy and sell real estate. School meeting cannot buy or sell real estate. School meeting can't enter into a loan agreement or a mortgage with a bank, that sort of thing. So it's pretty broad things. School meeting is not allowed to permit expenses to exceed income for a given year, and so on. So it's things like that. There were no policies in place that prohibited school meeting from applying for a variance that I'm aware of. I don't remember, I'm pretty sure that we did not, well, school meeting wasn't in session during the summer, so school meeting could not have voted to ask the Board of Trustees for permission to do that. If school had been in session, I feel pretty sure something would have gone before the Board of Trustees, but it wasn't a controversial choice, and trustees were certainly aware of it. The trustees were directly involved in project management of the construction of the new campus, and so there were individual trustees who knew absolutely every step we were taking. But thinking back on it, we may have missed a step. Our governance system may have required us to do something that we didn't do. But it was not a lawsuit. This was just an application for a variance. We were in our system of governance. We were clearly required to report that action after the fact. But whether we were required to get permission ahead, I I'm not clear about that.
Yeah, well, it's always a problem in the democracies, starting with Athens, about emergencies when it's impossible to make decisions democratically just because of it's just impossible. In Athens, I know visiting there, they have a special body of the judges who were on duty 24 hours and because of the whatever emergency can come. And later, exactly what you're talking about, later the full assembly in Athens, the whole assembly make decisions whether or not like to continue this ruling or the ruling was correct or not correct, but still the ruling will stay at least temporarily because
Yeah,
of the emergency matter. So that's
yeah,
understandable. It's kind of, it's interesting how issues of democracy is constantly re-emerged about with
yes.
this kind of.
Now, I am remembering that both school meeting and the trustees had formal opportunities to stop the process because the hearing, I believe the hearing actually, we were down to days before moving into our new campus when this emerged. And the hearing for it was scheduled a few weeks out. So I believe the hearing would have been after school had started up
Yeah.
for the new school year. So school meeting was informed of what was happening and could have said, nope, don't do that. And the trustees as well had been informed for many weeks. And had any individual trustee had a question about it, then it could have been taken up by the trustees. But neither body chose to take it up, which was implied approval of the action we were taking.
Mhm. Okay, well, I have two more issues, so and we're very good with time because we planned for 2 hours. So I think 30 minutes, maybe we'll have enough time to discuss them. So one issue, next issue, is actually another example, but I'm not sure. Is it what was that example? I remember that I was coming maybe 10 years ago, and now it's very difficult to say when it was. And I remember that some teenagers were involved in something to do with Occupy movement. At that time, it was maybe more than 10 years ago. Maybe it was like 13 years ago. When Occupy movement, Occupy Wall Street, Occupy this and that, it was very popular. And I don't remember what exactly these teenagers were doing. And this is question actually related to that. Do you have like cases, and maybe that was the case, when students decided to form, I don't know, club or a class to study some political issues, like for example, Occupy movement. What's the hell that? And like for example, my students. Let me give example from my students. My students, when the cancel culture phenomena become a very strong issue in United States, which is probably was people start talking broadly about that and discussing that maybe 4 or 5 years ago around this time. Maybe I can, maybe less, a little bit less. But anyway, some students introduce a new topic. In my classes, the students introduce new topics. The topic was about cancel culture in education. And we have actually, since then, we probably have 2 or 3 classes when the students choose that topic to discuss culture, just because they want to know and they want to also develop their own informed opinion about that, and they want to study what's that, and especially in education, how it's done, to see issues with that, and so on and so forth. So, do we have that situations in the past when students choose to study some kind of political things, or for example, even like during the elections, like what's going on, like what the big issues that people discussing around them, or to make even like mock elections and see how this like people in the school will vote for particular elections or particular top issue in the election. So did you have that situations in the past? Or by the way, was that case, if you remember that about Occupy, was that case of the students studying that, or they just participating in some kind of political club that people who really who knowledgeable but they want to promote some kind of occupy movement or to be part of that, or they want to study that. So like I'm open for
Yeah.
your answer. Yeah.
Regarding the Occupy movement, I'm not remembering what you might be referring to. There were certainly students who wanted to participate in Occupy events outside of school, but I'm not remembering how it might have intersected with the school in any way. But I might just be forgetting that. I think one way of framing this is that I think it's very healthy and developmentally appropriate for teens in particular to have strong interests in politics and public policy, and to often or sometimes to want to take what would be viewed as extreme positions in those. And that's wonderful. I think that's something to be celebrated and to welcome. We had a critical thinking discussion group going for maybe 3 years. And I was the staff member leading that, and that was mostly talking about political issues or current social issues or cultural issues. So and usually with controversy. I mean, that was controversial issues were a good way to get people's attention, and also a good way to exercise critical thinking skills. And that's what that group was formed to do, formed by a student who came to me and said, "Hey, my mom thinks I need better critical thinking skills. Um, can we have a critical thinking class?" And so we decided to use a discussion group format, and it attracted others. So that's one answer to your question, that there's absolutely no limit on what's fair game for discussion topics, except where there are developmental factors. So among teens, the older teens, there's probably no limits. With younger kids, there's some developmentally sensitive issues that would be that we'd want to curtail discussion of.
Do you remember, sorry, Jim, to interrupt you, do you remember particular political topics that maybe even recently the students discussed at this critical thinking? I don't know how you call it, club or class.
We called it a discussion group.
Discussion group, yeah, okay.
And the basic format was that we would gather at 9 o'clock in the designated place and open up the floor. What topic do you want to talk about today? And if nobody had anything, that I always came prepared with 3 or 4 or 5 candidates, and we'd decide what to talk about. The Supreme Court was often was a recurring theme, decisions coming out of the Supreme Court, where there's controversy and various viewpoints, and typically it would be either a case that was pending or a case that was recently decided. But most of the time, students had some awareness of the general case or the situation, but probably not specifics and facts about the case. So those were ripe for critical thinking discussion. So in that era, some of the things were social. I'm not thinking of specifics, but if you can think of any controversial issue of the day, from this was
immigration, for example, this issue of the immigration, no?
I don't know if immigration came up. I guess this took place mostly pre-pandemic. I think it stopped, right. It stopped when school was shut down
Okay.
for pandemic. So it would have been issues that were live
Back then.
And immigration, although it was certainly an issue back then, it didn't have the prominence in public discourse that it has now.
Okay.
It wasn't just political issues,
Of course.
but that was an important part
What
of it.
other issue? What non-political issue, if you remember?
Oh man, we came back to trolley problems over and over again.
Okay.
And so the ethical discussions, what would you do if? and what do you think should be, or what's ethically correct, or someone, often what would happen is some teen would come in all exercised about, indignant about something that was happening. And so that would
Mhm.
become a natural topic. Gender related issues were coming up back then. And so that was sometimes the topic. Go bags was a fun one, non-political. Well, not entirely non-political. So the go bag scenarios where we would say, you excuse me, you've got a go bag, and in that go bag you have room for 10 items or 20 items or whatever, and you are in Sudan in 2014, and the civil war is about to break out, and you are there as an economic development consultant working for USAID or whatever, and one side or other in this potential civil war, if they find you, you're toast. So what are you going to put in your go bag? Or on the other hand, you're in your home and you see a flood coming, or who knows what, and you've got to flee. What would you put in your go bag? And those were um, those were an interesting focus of many of our sessions as well. But it could be anything.
Mhm.
Politics being probably 2/3 of what we discussed, or political
Mhm.
and social issues. Social
That is-
justice, social
Mhm.
justice issues may have been number one. Supreme Court cases and narrow sorts of focused issues were right up there too.
Mhm. So, and it was interrupted by COVID, right? So COVID kind of sounds like stop that
Yeah,
tradition.
yes, yes. Lots of things disappeared and new things came up between
Mhm.
those two eras.
Okay. Well, the last question that I have actually, you mentioned that at the beginning, a very interesting point, which is I just want to give you. Uh, uh, it's interesting what you mentioned, and I would like to a little bit discuss that. You mentioned half seriously, half as joke, and this is kind of it's interesting to see how much it's a joke and how much it's a serious stuff. You mentioned something about magic wand, and you said that if you had magic wand, you would make all the schools democratic, something like that. Correct me if I'm wrong, if something I'm not saying it correctly. It's actually very interesting because a few classes ago, my classes with the college students in education, they asked me this question, which is I was not prepared to answer, I think, or not fully prepared. It was great because it's live questions when I was not prepared. And the question was like that, which is similar, although they used the Russian kind of metaphor for that. They asked me, if I were education czar, or Tsar in Russian. What would I do? And I was like thinking, well, the first thing I was thinking to make all public school diverse, exactly not to have this idea that they should be all democratic or all this or that. And it should be students who actually, or the parents as their proxies, decide what kind of school they want to do. And the government should give money for that without much asking questions except outrageous abuses. And then I was thinking a little bit more, and actually, not. We moved on. We discussed that, moved on, and then something bothered me, and I said, "Well, my second thing is not to have educational czar at all. That's somebody who make this this kind of monopolistic decisions and impose everything." The good things, what they think is good, on everybody else. So anyway, so what do you think about that? With
Well, I felt free to make the rash claim that if I had a magic wand, but I
yeah.
think that the truth is, if I had a magic wand, maybe the first thing I would do would be to destroy all the magic wands in the world.
Okay, so we
But
are on the same.
but I would not declare, I would not impose that all schools must be democratic. That would be It would be self-contradictory and it would not be productive. And also, the magic wand scenario, I don't want to be responsible for the unforeseen consequences of, of anything like that. And I think it's a lesson um, that we don't learn as a society, that it's the unforeseen consequences that get us, and using a magic wand abusively to impose policies and views that are not necessarily rational. Part of me would like to say, well, if I could wave my magic wand, I'd make everybody rational and reasonable. But
But that's also dangerous.
that's extremely dangerous. Maybe I'd wave my magic wand and say, well, I'm gonna make everybody think like me, and that would be disastrous, totally disastrous. So,
which is the big what's the definition of the reasonable and rational? That's
right,
like what's the
right,
example? Like me, thinking like me.
yeah. Now that said, I think that public policy and government would benefit greatly from uh, being formed with a greater element of reason and a lesser element of um, ideological commitment. Um, yeah, and I think that plays out in the circle school and democratic schools as well. That ideally we do not want to be committed to an ideology of education. We just want to be a place where people are getting together every day and being in community with adults who are able to mm, uh, help shape policies to be developmentally appropriate. We're just a community of people getting together. We're practicing life. That's our tagline, and we're committed not so much to an ideology as to a really broad principle that kids grow and develop through acting, through agency in community, that individuals don't grow in what I would regard as a wholesome way in isolation. They grow in a wholesome way embedded in community. And communities need individuals, need communities. So again, my ideal is that we're not committed to the ideologies of democracy uh, or anything else other than the narrow 12 statements of what we call ends we seek, and that's as far as our ideology goes.
Okay. Well, thank you, Jim. And let's finish on the things that what questions I didn't ask you about democratic education and politics, or what things that you would like to address. Just you want to address that because it's interesting for you or bothers you something or whatever. Or consider big issue there or something.
I don't have any big, broad issues that we haven't covered. I can say briefly what the Circle School is, what's active in the Circle School. I mentioned it a little earlier, and that is mm, how should the Circle School balance our democratic governance and institutional needs? That is, um, we have in recent years been on a trajectory that is sort of shifting the balance. I'm not sure whether maybe one way of saying it is that we are moving a little bit from in the direction. We've never been libertarian in a strong way or communitarian in a strong way, but in that center ground, I think maybe we're moving a little bit away from libertarian and more towards communitarian, or maybe it's responding to changes in the culture and the world around us. I think that really is what's going on. That we were kind of static for a number of years, and it became, when you're static, you tend to get committed to an ideology, or at least if not committed to it, you can tend to get trapped in it. And the fresher thinking becomes harder to access. And I think with some changes, partly through the pandemic, we've been rethinking much of what we do, as many of our colleague schools have been doing, and seeing changes in the world. One of them is what Jean Twenge calls the slow life. Kids are taking longer to grow up. Teenagers are more sophisticated in some ways and developmentally less mature in other ways. And how that impacts our school society, the structures and systems, is an important question that we're dealing with, as are many of our colleague schools. I think one of the strengths of democratic systems, at least in theory, is the ability to be somewhat self-renewing, to respond to changes. And yet, in a small institution, it can be easy to get locked into structures and practices and protocols just because they're there. But there is no one system that's going to endure in its effectiveness and appropriateness for the culture that it's immersed in. And so it's got to be resilient, responsive to what's happening in its own population and in the world beyond school. That's another reason, Eugene, why I would not use my wand to impose democratic schools everywhere. And that is that, well, first of all, every family is different, every child is different, and so there is no one kind of school that's right for everybody. But the other thing is that there's no one democratic version of democratic that is going to work for every community. We call the United States, the United Kingdom, Germany, France, we call them all democracies. But of course, they're not democracies. They're not large-scale democracies. They are democratic countries, but France is a unitary republic. The U.S. is a constitutional federal republic. The UK has a monarchy thrown in there. Germany is a parliamentary democracy. So they're all democratic, but very different in the structures and systems, and also different in the cultures. And so I wouldn't want to wave my magic wand and suddenly have a homogeneous world.
Just one quick example about this shift that you talk about from libertarian to more communitarian, governance or organization or something like that. Just one example.
Well, the creation of the Connectors program that I mentioned earlier.
Okay.
It's a scaffolding program. It's not a mandatory structure. It's mandatory for staff in a sense, but then staff, we don't pretend to be giving staff the kinds of freedoms that we're giving to students. But we're a container. We aren't a sovereign nation. We aren't the world. We have an institution that needs to preserve its own existence, and we need to provide enough structure to scaffold children's development. And the question is how much? If we were taking an entirely libertarian approach, which we never have, we would just be a venue without any sort of program. If we were at the communitarian end, we'd all be holding hands and singing songs and deciding everything by a fake consensus or a superficial consensus. But we're neither one of those, never have been. We're in that middle ground, which most democratic institutions are, I think. And so we're struggling with that at the moment. And then some of our colleague schools, the subject of offerings is one that enters into this. Should a school, as some of our colleagues do, put up a list of activities and you go and choose from among them, or you can choose none of them? Or should a school not suggest that? Is it coercive for an adult to suggest to a student, you'd love to do this. Now, in some schools, a suggestion from an adult is a suggestion, which is really a command in disguise. So that's the sort of thing that I suppose is in play here. How much should we do? How much should we not do in order to preserve the idea of agency in community, which for me is the bedrock.
Mhm. Well, thanks a lot, Jim, and thank you for being our first invited guest for our new format. We'll see how it will going, and it will be very interesting to see questions and comments and of the people will put for our podcast. Thanks a lot. Appreciate it.
Thanks for inviting me. I'm honored to have been the first guest on this new podcast. Thank you, Dr. Matusov.
Thank you. And see you tomorrow.
Yes.
Bye.